do lower working hours contribute to increased productivity, really?
Yeah.
Or
So,
did the
so
lower working hours force companies to invest in labor-saving devices that
exactly.
then increase productivity?
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the New Normal Business Show presented by SERVIO Technologies, co-presented by Bitstop Network Services, Data Center, and MB Tech News. Joey started his IT career back in the 1980s when he first worked with Apple and then Microsoft. He was the president of the Philippine Software Industry Association in 2013 and 2014, and he is now serving as a director or coach to several companies, including startups, SERVIO Technologies being one of them. He also devotes his time in helping businesses as a business technology coach. Our next speaker is Wilson Shua. Wilson has founded several success startups centered around data management, processing, storage, and analytics. He is the president of Bitstop Network Services Data Center in Dagupan. He finished his master's in information technology at the NUS and a gold medal awardee of the Singapore Computer Society. He is also a technology columnist for Manila Bulletin Tech News. So let's welcome our speakers, Joey and Wilson. Welcome, Joey. Welcome, Wilson.
Good afternoon, guys.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Brian. Thanks for the as well. So we have a very, I think, a very earth-shattering topic to
Yeah.
discuss today,
Mhm.
which is the disruptions to SMEs, specifically those that could threaten the very survival of SMCs. What are the disruptions that are threatening the very survival of SMEs?
Yeah. Tell them, Joey. Tell them.
So, we did a little bit of research before this, di ba?
Yeah.
And we classified the three major disruptions happening in the business world today as fall into three categories. Una, legal changes,
Yep.
changes to our legal framework that govern how we how we can operate our businesses. Una yon, legal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Pangalawa, significant changes to the
Aspect.
social aspect of our daily lives, which also affect the businesses that
Yeah.
are,
Later on, the death of the malls.
yes, talking about malls and campuses and all areas that generally, from a business standpoint, require some kind of socialization.
Yep.
And finally, operations. What
Mhm.
are the impact on our very, very specific business operations that this pandemic and the new normal is having?
The
So,
added constraints of
added
operation.
constraints.
Yeah.
The new, meron tayong new normal, meron tayong new problems as a
Yeah.
result of the new
Well,
normal.
they might be opportunities for our listeners to take
Might be,
advantage of. Yeah.
might be. So,
Mm-hmm.
tatlo yan,
Mm-hmm.
legal, social, and operational. And I think there's no better time than now to jump into it. Let's talk about the first one, Wilson, because when we were having this discussion, parang ito yung unang nag-trigger sa'yo about the
Yung
legal changes in our legal framework. So tell us what exactly triggered you about this.
So, Congressman Joey Salceda has proposed a work-life balance bill that proposes to reduce the working hours from 40, gagawing 35. And guess what? If you read along the lines, your employees work less but get paid the same. And if they render overtime beyond the 8 hours, they get premium payment. So like, na-trigger ako ron. And I wanted to understand the congressman's reasoning behind that. So he cited mga in most countries, remember, in most countries where you reduce the average annual working hours of the workers, the GDP I
That is kind of the argument, right?
so
That's the
so
argument.
so he would have us believe that if you reduce working hours, productivity will go up, and so win-win for everyone. But we caution that this might be what we call. Um, you have to remember that correlation is not causation, right? So we looked at the same scatter plot chart that he showed, where you find countries along the GDP and the axis and the annual average work hours on the y-axis. And true enough, European countries, most developed countries, you will see their GDP increases as their annual work hours decreases, right? But if you look closely, you will find that two countries do not belong to the same pattern.
Yeah,
Notably, China and India. They have consistently increased GDP without lowering the annual working hours. So what does that tell you? It tells us that the arguments of lowering working hours would not necessarily increase productivity. It is not on solid footing. And so we have to ask ourselves, do lower working hours contribute to increased productivity, really?
yeah.
Or
So
did the
so
lower working hours force companies to invest in labor-saving devices that
exactly.
then increase productivity?
So take a step back lang, no, Wilson. I mean, given the fact that we're just in the third day of our GCQ right now, pangatlong
Uh-huh.
araw pa lang to, so we're already seeing there are quite a few challenges already, just even getting people to work. The last 2 days have shown that. So to understand this bill better, they're really saying
Um, Asian Review came up with the headline, ASEAN banks prepare for a flood of bad loans amid the coronavirus. And if you don't believe that, we took a look at big data because we're interested in big data. And one source for near real time of business closure is Yelp. So in the US, there's this Yelp service that acts as a customer review of various businesses. And what do they
right.
tell us? There are currently 176,822 businesses that have filed for bankruptcy. And so, Brian, if you can show the slide, you can see all the states where there are more closures. So mostly East Coast and West Coast, mga metropolitan areas.
Yep. And that's a lot. That's a lot of closures in such a short period of time. That is unprecedented in the history of the United States. That goes all the way back to the Great Depression in the 1920s.
Yes. Nabit na yung record. And right now, 40 million and over US citizens or Americans are unemployed.
Yep. So
So
imagine with all of the even with all of the government bailout and subsidies that are going on there, nangyari pa yan. How much more in a country like the Philippines or in other Asian countries where the level of government support, financial support, is not at the same level as the U.S. There's going to be a lot of closures, right?
yes, we're bracing for that now. And thankfully, I think the Department of Labor in the Philippines recognize that real possibility. And so they came up with the DOLE Labor Advisory number 17, year 2020, section 4-3. So instead of closing shop, they are allowing employers to cut the effective working hours of people with commensurate cut in pay. So
In
that
cost.
yeah, so I think that's a fairer policy, right, than the one being proposed by Congressman Salceda, which I think will drive more people to close up.
So that's a good example of how the changes in the legal framework, in this case, this new bill that's been introduced about reducing forced reduction of work hours without a commensurate reduction in the cost of that labor.
So
Compare that now to House Bill or the Labor Advisory, which allows us to reduce the working hours, but with a commensurate reduction in cost.
right, so
Dapat ganun ang ating changes in legal framework.
diba we were talking about this, it then becomes a de facto salary hike.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
again, increase in cost. Going to the next general disruption is what we call the social disruption.
Yeah, the death of the malls.
Yeah, this pandemic has actually caused two very important socializing areas to basically be shut down. One are malls, especially in the Philippines. Iba ang mall natin sa Pilipinas, parang park yan eh. That's
Mm-hmm.
where people go to socialize, is the mall. Now, it's gone. The other,
Yeah.
especially for younger people in school, is campus. The campus life,
Yeah.
which for most people between the ages of 18 and 25, that's where they find themselves socializing. That's also been devastated, taken away.
Here. Well, what's interesting is Forbes made an analysis, and it seems that not all malls suffer the same fate. So apparently, the Class A malls are still have strong foot traffic. What's getting hit are the Class B and Class C malls that are saturating the market. Ibig sabihin, these are smaller malls that are located in the same neighborhood. So they just cannibalize their own sales. You can see the trend of sales between department stores and online sales over the
Right.
last 10 years. You can see over here that the department store sales are going down year on year, while online sales are going up year on year. Now, what's that? What is driving that factor? If you then flash the succeeding slide, you will see that cost, the number of employees you need to generate 1 million in sales per annum are going down for online sales. So
Yep.
online sales are more efficient than the core retail. So the cost of operating a brick and mortar is higher than the cost of operating an online store.
So much higher than in the physical world than the digital world. And so, of
Mm-hmm.
course, if the costs are much higher there, then obviously your margins and your profit is much lower.
Mm-hmm.
So, are you suggesting then that anybody who is basically dependent on mall culture for a business should really already be shifting to e-commerce, to online retail, as opposed to continuing
Yeah,
to hang on to the physical retail?
they need to have a digital strategy to complement their brick and mortar stores.
In
Correct.
those, right? And I'd
Mm-hmm.
like to maybe look at another social area, physical public space that's been impacted by the pandemic, and that's campuses,
Mm-hmm.
schools,
Yep.
where most of our younger people, ages 18 to 25, that's their social area. And with this now, na medyo nawala na yon. As a matter of fact, I'd like to say I was at a conference last week with a private university, and they were saying that they had already taken a survey of 397 students in college. These are private schools, okay? So these are not exactly these are not naman siguro well-to-do, but they're middle class.
Yeah.
And they surveyed them and asked them, what would you agree to if when we resume classes in August? Either number one, 100% distance learning, so no need to come to campus. Option two, hybrid, 50% on campus, 50% distance. And third, 100% on campus. You know, out of 397 students surveyed by the school, all but 3 students chose the last option, which is they will only agree to a 100% on campus experience. And the 3 who did not vote for that chose the hybrid. Zero, absolutely zero, would even consider distance learning. And when they ask them why, the two most commonly cited reasons are number one, no device, but number two, poor internet connectivity, either none or poor. So in this situation, talagang malaki yung impact ng connectivity to even considering something that is less than physical. Right, Wilson?
Well, as my buddies in the stats and sampling arena tells me, really, for studies like that, we need to know how they selected their sample size, right? Ma and who did the study? Kasi baka na ano yan, na tilt na yeah,
Yeah,
there
in
may
this
be
case,
bias in the study.
pandemic.
So there's a disconnect because I also read somewhere that DepEd also conducted their own study, which shows that online would work. So
Well,
so is
this,
that like, what's the what?
But Wilson, the only people who could respond to the online survey are
Yeah,
people who have online connectivity, right? So, yung mga walang connectivity, di
hindi
makasagot.
makaset. So that goes to where what I'm saying, selection bias. But then remember, 67% of the country's population have access to Facebook,
Yes.
right?
Bakit?
So
So,
so
but
bakit
ganun?
yung sa DepEd overwhelmingly okay sa kanila online education, but in the private school overwhelmingly they want face to face. Now, I agree that if that those results do warrant additional investigation. There
Right.
may be more than meets the eye.
But would you say that in general that there is definitely a lack of coverage and lack of availability of good internet connectivity, which is working against these two areas, going into e-commerce and going into distance learning, among other things. Marami pang iba eh. Distance telemedicine and other services over the internet. What's really working against that is the fact that most people do not have ideal connections. Do we have any data to suggest that that's actually what's happening?
Two things that you have to think about is, number one, is there internet? And number two, how much does it cost me to connect to those online resources?
Right.
Because the internet cost in the Philippines is among the highest in Asia Pacific,
Yep.
right?
And
So the
that's why I
cost to
think that
connect
that
is. Mhm.
you had brought to my attention something that Senator Ralph Recto was trying to push through. Would
Yeah.
you
So that's a good
describe it?
news. That's a good news. We now have a new convert in the Senate, because prior to this, there was an open access bill that was approved at the lower Congress, at the lower House, that went up to Senate and sat there under the same senator, Ralph Recto. He didn't do anything about it. But with COVID coming out, and I guess, he must have realized the deleterious effects of having poor internet on education. On entertainment, ABS-CBN is now off the airwaves. So for the Class C and D to be able to catch ABS-CBN, you now need ubiquitous and affordable internet. And so now I'm happy to share with you the news that Senator Recto is now the champion of the open access bill. So
Yeah,
let's see where it goes.
and I think that's just a real good sign that something does have to be done. I'm glad to hear that Senator Ralph Recto is trying to push that because I think internet connectivity is a deterrent.
Hmm.
If the lack of connectivity is a deterrent. Let's move on to the third area, which is
Hmm.
the operational disruptions. And maybe for this one, when we talked about this earlier, there are really two. No, one is in the workplace, all of the different, as we talked about in the last episode, all of the health monitoring and all of the safety
Social
requirements,
distancing, yeah.
social distancing, lahat ng ginagawa natin sa loob ng ating offices and workspaces that are new now,
Hmm.
but also outside when it comes to the supply chain, the
Yeah.
impact on the supply chain because of the checkpoints and the lack of public transportation and all of the other fears that have been introduced into the supply chain.
Right. So
So
like,
those have had big impact,
you,
right?
yeah, you've heard of the famous Japanese practice of just in time,
Just
where
in time.
you're not supposed to keep inventories. And but guess what? With COVID and you have supply chain disruption, you now have to maintain extra inventories of your raw materials. Otherwise, your production
Yes.
itself will be disrupted. So these are the things that.
And as any businessman knows, the more you have to keep an inventory, the more it costs you to
Yeah.
run your business. I mean, that's
Hmm.
inventory is basically cash tied up and into something which is not moving, as opposed to those things that are in fact moving. So you're right. It used to be maybe you can say I can just keep enough inventory for the next week,
Right. So,
but
Brian,
now
if you show the chart, you can see the survey done by Bain on Chinese businessmen around February 2020. What are their major concerns? Supply chain disruption and their key business partners undergoing critical challenges themselves. These are the major issues confronting the Chinese businessmen.
Supply chain is a big thing. If you're in any kind of a buy and sell, manufacturing, production, even something as simple as office supplies, if that is disrupted, it impacts
Face
your
mask na
operations.
lang. Face mask
Yes.
na lang, right? So like there was this country, I think it was Indonesia or Malaysia. They had the machines to make face masks, but guess what? The raw material came from Wuhan, which was locked down.
So talk about constraint in supply chain. So operations is the other area that has been very much disrupted by the pandemic and this thing we call the new normal. So let's move on and think about these three disruptions. These are
Hang on,
business ending,
there's still one more that we should cover,
which is
and which is the corporate income taxes. So
okay.
Brian, can you do me the favor of flashing the corporate income tax? I got this chart from a talk by Director Mitch Abdon of the Department of Finance last week. Data that the Philippines has the highest corporate income tax rate at 30%. And Joey, you were saying something about your filing income taxes in Singapore?
Yeah, so I won't mention any specific figures, but the deadline for filing tax in Singapore for 2019 was just last weekend, and because I am a Singapore taxpayer, I filed my taxes then, and just for the sake of comparison,
Comparison, yeah.
yeah, I did a little bit of calculation to see what would happen if I had filed for the same level of income in the
Mm-hmm.
Philippines, and the result, I would have paid 7 times more in
So,
taxes.
so that 7 times more is money that's not invested in R&D. 7 times more money not invested in employee incentive and training programs. And then
Right.
government turns around and say, our Philippine industry are not competitive. Eh, our tax rates are killing us.
Yes, yes. So the question now becomes, we've got problems in the legal framework, disruptive issues with the legal framework working against business. We have disruptive issues in the social fabric of our society,
Mm-hmm.
which is working against business. And now we've got operational issues with the corporate income tax, the supply chain, and these new requirements being placed on us in terms of our occupational health and safety. I mean, these are business ending events, aren't
Right.
they? They're
Yep.
business ending. So the question then becomes, and
How can
I know
business
we don't
owners
have,
cope?
yes, we don't have enough time to cover probably all of them, but let's quickly just take a look. How do you react to this? How do you survive if you're an SME? How do you survive beyond these disruptions?
Well, you're the business coach guru. So can you talk more about the business
Yeah,
model
so
canvas and the digital maturity?
So one of the things that we do a lot of with startups and even businesses that are undergoing transformation is that we take a look at their business model.
Mm-hmm.
And when something like this hits your business, when something this disruptive, you lose entire market segments, customer segments. In the case of a mall, you just
Mm-hmm.
lost that target market, right? Or you've
Mm-hmm.
lost your production capabilities because of supply chain problems, or the laws are passed that makes your current operations unprofitable. You really have
Yeah.
to look at your business model, and it's time to pivot. You need to pivot. You
Blue
can't
ocean.
blue ocean. You have to look for something new. You pivot from the direction you've been going on before, and now look for a new direction that will allow you to navigate through these disruptions. So, if you haven't already looked at the business model canvas, and I strongly recommend it's a free service, leanstack.com. Take a
Okay.
look at that. It's a free service. Map out your business model as it is right now, and then use that as a way to figure out where your pivot is.
Right.
And maybe that pivot, hopefully, will put you in a direction where you become less and less of a physical business,
Mm-hmm.
become more and more of a digital business,
Mm-hmm.
and undergo what we are now been referring to as
Digital
digital transformation.
transformation. Right.
There you go. There you go.
Right. So in the interest of saving time, I just finished one book by Tony Saldana, Why Digital Transformations Fail. So the key idea here is by learning why digital transformations fail, you now know what to avoid and what to do.
Yes.
Right? So that's
Good
the
book.
book. Yeah,
It's a good
that's the
book.
book. Right.
Yes.
And the
So
other one is when digital becomes human. So the key tenet of this book is, as process become digital, the value of human interaction goes up.
goes up. So digital transformation does not mean removing the human element from
Hmm.
the customer experience. It means that we replace, shall we say, the more rote part of that experience with digital. But the most important aspects of that is still, that is only a path to the real objective. And the real objective is to digitally transform, to become more of a digital business. And although there are many different frameworks and different models out there, we've actually come up with one that is more relatable, more applicable to Philippine SMEs, but
Hmm.
also more importantly, easier to understand, to implement, and to put into practice. And we call that our digital maturity model, and it is what we use in SERVIO Technologies to help SMEs, owners and managers of SMEs, turn from a physical business to become more of a digital business. And again, those of you interested in that, click on the link below, and we'll get back in touch with you on how we can help you
Yeah,
become more of a digital business.
and in closing, Brian, can you show the chart where we show that 77% of of business leaders believe that speed in IT is the most important thing in their ability to enter new markets and launch new products quickly. Yeah.
And that becomes so much more important in the current new normal. Diba?
Mm-hmm.
Speed becomes more important because we no longer have the physical space as a way to measure speed. Speed is now measured in terms of how quickly you can react in the digital space.
Right.
So there you
And
go.
and so
Okay.
we're done.